Thank you all for watching my virtual LCA 2021 talk about GPL enforcement strategy. I want to start out by thanking the LCA organizers. I'm really glad that the LCA organizers have put in so much work to make an online conference work. I want to point out that I suspect the organizers did not sign up to have a conference that was going to be run online, but they've done their best to put it together. And I really want to thank them for making an effort during this global pandemic to have the conference actually happen. In a normal year, when there's not a global pandemic, I'm usually traveling all over the world, usually flying somewhere once a month. And frankly, the most enjoyable and exciting and really community-inspiring trip is the trip every year, or most years, to Australia or New Zealand to speak at LCA. I'm so sad that I can't physically be there with you this year. And all things told, if that's the worst thing that happens to me during COVID, I've come out so much better than everyone else who's faced such pain and difficulty and anguish during this period. And I really just want to thank the LCA organizers for making some sort of event happen and recognize that there are serious challenges. So I've often been accused now and then of always giving the same talk. I don't think that I actually do. I think while I've given hundreds and hundreds of talks, I believe, on the GPL going back to the late 1990s, and I've talked extensively about GPL enforcement, I looked back at a lot of the slides, and while I borrow a slide here and there, or maybe more than one or two here and there, I have generally found that there are new things always going on with GPL enforcement, that the world has changed out from underneath us over the years. And unfortunately, the situation with compliance with the GPL and copyleft licenses has not improved. In fact, the situation has gotten much worse. I would even say the situation these days is quite dire. If you saw my talk in New Zealand in LCA 2019, you saw the image of this laptop, which is very close to the laptop that I first installed Linux on in 1992. And it really is my view that Linux changed everything for an entire generation of software developers. It showed us that we wouldn't be confined to what job we could get or to who we might be able to meet to get access to source code, but that our operating system software, and really all of our software in those days and throughout the 90s, was going to be available in source form. We were going to be allowed to modify it and reinstall it and use our computers with new versions of the software that we installed. Now, of course, the computers of those days were not much like the computers today. And in this regard, I've thought often of the Greek mythological figure of Cassandra, who, for those of you that like me, have been out of school for a long time and haven't taken Greek mythology in a while, Cassandra was cursed with the ability to tell the future, but that no one she told the future to would believe her. And I feel that I've been saying for years that if we didn't stand up for copyleft, if we didn't assure that we had the right to modify the software on our devices, if we didn't fight the fight that was necessary to make sure copyleft actually worked, that we would end up in a dystopia of proprietarized Linux. And the fact is today that there are millions and billions even of IoT devices deployed with Linux on them. And the source code is available for very few of them. And the ones that have the source code available do not comply with the GPL, and they do not give you the source code that you're supposed to get when you get a copy of Linux. I want to do a brief thought experiment. Let's imagine for a minute if the world changed tomorrow and everyone just didn't pay their licensing fees anymore for software. The examples I could think of are things like Microsoft 365 and Google Docs, these online applications, which many people use without paying for. Of course, they're not paying for them because they're giving their data over to these companies. But a lot of businesses do pay to get a certain number of users or to get more for pay features. But imagine if everyone stopped paying. And imagine even further that there were lots of browser plugins that would perfectly, and I mean perfectly, avoid giving all your data, massive data collection stuff over to the companies that run these online applications. Remember that even when you're not paying for Google software, you are paying for it because you're paying for it with your private data. But let's imagine for a minute if we could make all that not happen by doing stuff on our end, and we all just stopped paying for proprietary software. We all just violated the agreements that they say. We all got the features. People broke into Microsoft and Google and stole whatever they needed to steal. Imagine that kind of world. Like, I'm not advocating for this by any means, but imagine if it happened. Now imagine that Google and Microsoft get upset about this situation and they start complaining to people. And they go to a user and they say to that user, gee, you really have to pay these licensing fees. And that user says, well, let's set up a conference call with my lawyer and we'll talk about it. And they go to the conference call and Google lawyers show up and you and your lawyer show up and your lawyer says, well, my client's not going to pay the licensing fees. I'm not going to possibly, do anything that I have to do. I have everything I want. I don't care what Google's problems are. I don't care that Google is putting all this effort into the software and not getting for the simple things it asked for with only $5 a month, but I'm not going to pay the $5 a month for the extra features to Google Docs. Sorry, I won't do it. Imagine if that happened. Imagine what the industry reaction would be. Imagine what Google and Microsoft would say if this happened. They would say the entire software industry was collapsing, that the world was in anarchy, and that people were refusing to obey the agreements that they had. You can just imagine how angry the companies would be. It would be in the news every single day that people were doing this, and they wouldn't stop, and that they wouldn't do what Google said, and Google had no ability to compel them to do anything. Imagine if that were the case. Now, I don't have to imagine this because that's exactly what's happening with the GPL. We go and enforce the GPL, and we're told by companies that claim to be our friends, that claim to be pro-Linux, that if you even once go to a company and say they're violating GPL, if that's ever once in the news, a lawyer at a major Linux company told me this, high ranking in their legal department, that if just once it's in the news that someone has asked for the source code for GPL and gotten angry at a company about it and demanded that source code, that they have lost. He said to me that if a single customer asks them about the GPL, they consider that a failure for their business that has to be addressed. That's the climate we live in. That's what we're up against to enforcement of the GPL. We don't have the luxury to ask for the source code without being attacked politically. We don't have the luxury to go to a company and say, please give us the source code and be respected. Instead, we get lined up on the telephone with them for months on end, them arguing with us about every single line of the GPL, arguing with us about what their users do or don't want, arguing with us about what the Linux community believes and who the Linux community agrees with. The fact is, the Linux community is a very diverse group of people and have lots of opinions. And I am sure there are many people in the Linux community who would be absolutely okay if Linux were not under the GPL, and if Linux were available to put into any proprietary application or device that you wanted to without any restrictions. There are, of course, those people. But there are also people like me and like Matthew Garrett and like Harold Velta and like Wolfram Zhang and 100 other Linux developers who contribute to Linux because they know it's under copyleft and they believe that it is morally right for people to receive their source code and the right to build and modify and install it. This is the most forgotten part of GPL v2, which is Linux's license. It's not just about the source code itself. It's not just about what ends up in the upstream Linux tree, although that's certainly important. It is not the most important thing in the world of IoT devices. What's the most important thing is the ability to recompile and reinstall. Very famously, there's this story of the printer that was proprietary that launched the software freedom movement. When we think about that printer, what do we think the users wanted to do with it if they could get the source code? Did they want to build their own printer separately from scratch and be able to use that software on that other printer? Of course not. They wanted to install the source code rebuilt from scratch onto that very same printer with improvements, fixes, changes. This is ultimately the promise of the GPL. This is ultimately what the GPL assured we would have. This is what we had at the time of the early laptops we could install Linux on. We had a device that could run this system and be reinstalled from scratch from our own build. Things like Gen 2 came into existence where you could bootstrap your entire system from source code. That is the world that we lived in once. In the world of the IoT device, that is no longer true for Linux. We got here in part because of GPL enforcement. We got to a community because we didn't just license the software under the GPL and hope that it would work, but we went out there and found cases where it wasn't working and made sure the GPL worked. You've probably seen this slide before if you saw my 2019 LCA talk or many of my other talks online. The reason I keep putting it in my talks, even though I get accused of giving the same talk sometimes, is to remind everybody that there are projects like the OpenWRT project, now a member of Software Freedom Conservancy where I work, that owe their entire launch, their existence, their first commit to their repository due to GPL enforcement. And indeed, OpenWRT, by getting that bootstrap and by Linksys being told you have to release your source code because it's based on Linux and BusyBox and a dozen other GPL programs, and if you don't do it, you will not be able to build your devices on Linux anymore. That message that got delivered properly and early to the wireless router industry made sure that the wireless router industry, while it's full of non-compliance, I know currently of at least 3 different major manufacturers who have been violating the GPL for years, and we at Conservancy are working to get that resolved. The majority of the wireless router market, very different from the rest of the IoT device space, complies with the GPL, or at the very least releases devices that even if they have a weirdly non-compliant firmware, can be replaced with the OpenWRT firmware that's available. That power, that ability to install your own firmware on your own devices is the promise of the GPL. It is what we are working towards. And I'm thrilled that we've achieved it with OpenWRT. And I'm so glad they've joined Conservancy as a project, and I'm looking forward to helping them more and more. But we need a world where not just wireless router devices are free, but everything else is free. Copyleft functioned in that case because people, and myself included, I was involved in that early enforcement action, got together and demanded that it work. Many times developers think adding copyleft to their code will just magically make it work. Magically make software freedom happen. It's not magic pixie dust. It's a first step in a process to assure software freedom, but too often we take only the first step and assume that it's going to work from there. Now, I don't like having to do GPL enforcement. My colleague Karen Sandler and I spend a lot of our time doing GPL enforcement, and it's not that we like it. It's an adversarial process, and I would rather work in collaboration. I got into free software so I could collaborate with people, not be adversaries people. And quite frankly, it's rather boring to sit on conference calls with lawyers and have them say the same things over and over again, stonewall in exactly the same ways, and do this constant dance with them to convince them that they should be complying with the GPL. I'm a political pariah, and Karen became one after joining Conservancy, in part because of GPL enforcement. In fact, because of GPL enforcement. She told me when I urged her to come work with me as executive director, we had this conversation where I'm like, well, Bradley, you're well known, she said, for being a little bit aggressive and resistant, and you rub people the wrong way sometimes. I took the feedback, and it's just part of my personality. I know that happens. And I said, well, this is great, Karen. You can join us, and you're somebody that is wonderful and kind and friendly and very principled, but you deliver the message in a much friendlier way than I do. And she sort of convinced me, like, look, these problems about GPL enforcement, this political difficulty that we have with it, that's going to melt away once we're giving a little more friendly message. And she spent years giving that friendly message, and companies pushed back because they were not willing to negotiate. The industry does not want there to be any GPL enforcement. They don't just want a little, they don't just want it done in certain ways. We spent a tremendous amount of time drafting the principles of community-oriented GPL enforcement, which actually got us attacked from the other side because folks who wanted us to be more aggressive enforcement were angry at us for being too nice and friendly in those principles. And the companies that were telling us, well, if you were just more reasonable, this wouldn't be such a problem, they read our principles and said, well, that's nice, but it still means you're doing enforcement. So it's not good enough. It has to stop. Enforcement has to stop. Otherwise, you're just politically toxic. I wish I could just be a developer. I got into free software because I liked writing software that I shared and collaborated with other people. I don't want to have to do GPL enforcement. But when I look at the great GPL enforcers in history, like Howard Velta, who has done more to enforce the GPL in his career than almost everyone, just can't bear to do it anymore because he wants to be a developer. And I want him to be a developer because he's such a talented and amazing software developer. I'm glad he's out there writing code again, not doing GPL enforcement. But I'm a mediocre software developer at best, I admit. So I'm looking at what needs to be done in the community, and Karen's looking at what needs to be done. And we're saying we have to stand up for copyleft. We have to stand up for copyleft because from my point of view, I don't see how free software works without copyleft. The reason why is that companies have made it clear they will collaborate on some code bases. They're willing to draw lines and say, this is the code base we'll collaborate on. This is the stuff we'll proprietarize. They've drawn those lines pretty low down the stack. There's not very much code that they want to be free, that they want to collaborate with other companies on. And they certainly want the freemium models and ability to make proprietary add-ons and so forth. Only copyleft, with its ability to say, modified version improvements of the software have to be licensed under the same license and shared with everyone. Only that can assure. In fact, I believe Linux's success is due in large part to the fact that it was copylefted, because early in its existence, it did not get proprietarized. That, from my point of view, is the most important thing that Linux brought, was an excellent piece of software that was under copyleft. I can't stress enough that the perception of Linux and copyleft remains problematic. I gave a keynote actually at FOSDEM on GPL enforcement. And in my interview, I was asked this question of, don't developers just think it's magic pixie dust? And I just said yes. I just said, absolutely, that's what they think. They don't want to be involved in these politics. They don't want to hear about the annoying politics. They want to hear about how often we have to sit on conference calls with lawyers. It is demoralizing to know that if you find a device on the market that has Linux on it, you could well be waiting 2 years and hundreds of hours on the phone with lawyers to even get a chance to get the source code for it that actually builds and installs. I get completely that developers will feel demoralized by that. My goal, and Karen's goal, and the goal at Software Freedom Conservancy is to change the nature of copyleft such that when someone sees that something GPL'd, they know that they have a right to get the source code. They know that they will do it. We have an uphill battle. While we've been trying slowly but surely to do GPL enforcement, spending time on these conference calls, companies have been busy as well. This is the contribution statistics for Linux 4.8 from 3 years ago. As you can see, most of the people contributing to Linux are not individuals, they're companies. It's amazing to me to hear people get so upset about copyright assignment and so upset about the idea of a nonprofit, a charity like Conservancy, or individuals even going out there and asserting their rights on copylefted software, when you realize that most of the developers today contributing to Linux are working for these companies. Almost all of them did not get an agreement to keep their own copyrights. That means that over time, the majority of copyrights in Linux are slowly being put under the control of a small oligarchy of companies. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that there are multiple GPL violators on this list you're looking at. There are multiple companies that, while they don't violate the GPL, they do not want to see it enforced and are politically active in trying to prevent Conservancy from enforcing the GPL. And when we look at today, the situation has gotten even worse. This is from just back in 6 months ago for the 5.8 release. We see that companies still are in control of the base. And the number of unaffiliated or consultant contributions keeps falling down the list. Time is running out. Companies saw ahead. Unlike my situation of feeling like Cassandra, where I was trying to tell people to worry and no one would, companies worried early on. They saw that Linux was a liability for them, at least its license was. And they've made efforts to change the contribution structure of Linux, to change the way the community operates, to assure that companies, rather than individuals, have a substantially stronger ability to influence policy and decision-making with regard to things like licensing and whether or not the license is enforced. Linux has done an excellent job at keeping the technical decision-making in the hands of developers. But the policy decision-making has slowly and quietly moved to some of the largest corporations in the technology field. That is very disturbing. There's an upside. There's a big upside, fortunately. And to get to that upside, we just need a plan. We need a plan of how we're going to make use of the GPL, which is already there. The interesting thing about all these companies controlling Linux is while they don't necessarily want to enforce with regard to their own copyrights, maybe they don't want to actually act. Maybe they actually want to put and do put effort into political control and political action to prevent enforcement. But if we have a good plan and we're prepared to go against some of the biggest names in the technology sector, then we still have the GPL itself. We still have the text of the GPL. It is still the license of Linux. Indeed, even these copyrights, which are more and more gaining in corporate control, are still being licensed under the GPL, which means we still can implement a plan. And I'm here at this talk today to tell you that Conservancy, Software Freedom Conservancy, where I work, has a plan. Through an accident of various historical events, we have been saddled with the defend copyleft for Linux job. Maybe it's just because we're willing to take it on when no one else is, which is probably pretty likely, but we're taking it on. And the most important thing that we're keeping in our plan is that it's okay to have a lawsuit about the GPL. They are happening anyway. And we believe that, like many other social justice movements in history, which I truly believe software freedom is a social justice movement for the rights of users and consumers and owners of electronics devices, that the rights and privileges to copy, share, modify, and redistribute software, those freedoms and rights, I believe, are fundamental in the age of technology. And they have to be fought for and they have to be defended. And throughout our history, since legal systems came into existence, when powerful forces like large tech companies attempted to curtail or manipulate the rights of consumers and individuals, the courts were where we went. The courts are the place where justice happens. And from my point of view, we need a whole lot of copyleft justice right now. The fact of the matter is, other companies are litigating over the GPL right now, today. There are multiple lawsuits in the United States and other jurisdictions where folks are litigating over the GPL. One company suing another, and the other one saying, well, that's GPL'd and therefore, and so forth. Just recently, we talked about on our website, the two wireless router manufacturers, Ubiquiti and Cambium, were suing each other. They recently settled that case. They settled that case, yet neither of them is actually in compliance right now with the GPL. When other companies litigate over the GPL, they don't litigate to make sure the GPL is upheld. They litigate to their own ends, to get a business advantage over their opponent, to get money from their opponent in the court case. When the community goes to court, we go to court to fight for the users, the individuals, the people who get devices. I don't think companies who sue each other should decide who benefits from the GPL. The GPL, right in the name, is for the general public. It is a license for everyone to uphold their rights, to make sure that they have the right to copy, share, modify, redistribute, and reinstall their software on their devices. Conservancy is taking on this job as a community activist organization to fight for the copyleft of Linux. I know this isn't an easy job. It's a job I've been trying to do for the last 20 years of my career, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully. And like Cassandra, I've been saying, it's going to get worse. Please do something, help us. And discovered that basically what we have to do at Conservancy is come up with the right strategy as experts. We are looking at every little nook of legal theory. We're re-examining the GPL very carefully to figure out how it works from first principles and what it can do for individual users and consumers. We're thinking again about how do we actually go about GPL enforcement. It's very dangerous to fall into just one way of looking at it. I believe fundamentally in the Ralph Waldo Emerson quote that a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. This is often quoted, by the way, without the word foolish. You must consider whether your consistency is valuable or foolish first, but you must always be willing to ask yourself that question. And I think our community of folks who care about copyleft have to ask ourselves that question. Do we have a legal approach to copyleft that may work better than the one we've tried in the past? And if so, we should try it. Trying new things can mean failure, but there are plenty of great tech talks about why failure is okay. You have to try new things and you have to sometimes fail. The important thing is to try many strategies, to have multiple approaches to a problem so that if one of them fails, another one can succeed. And that's exactly what we have to do with litigation strategies and other strategies related to enforcement of the GPL. This is not an easy fight. If you walk into an electronics store today or well, I guess no one walks into electronic stores, but let's say you do a curbside pickup or order online from an electronics retailer, the odds are extremely high. I don't have enough sample size to give you an exact data, but I have not been able to buy an IoT device that complied with the GPL that had Linux in it for at least 5 years. Every single device that's passed through my hands that had Linux in it was violating the GPL in some way. I have not heard from anyone who can confirm definitively that they bought a Linux-based device that complied with the GPL. That's how bad it is. The compliance is the exception, not the rule. We're actively engaged in GPL enforcement at all times at the Software Freedom Conservancy. We have been since we began doing GPL enforcement for the BusyBox project, and since we began doing GPL enforcement and that was in 2006, since we began doing GPL enforcement in 2012 for Linux, we have been actively engaged in some compliance matter or other, usually many at a time, for that entire period, 14 years. And in those 14 years, we usually would get compliance, except in the last two. In the last two, we've gotten no compliance on any device whatsoever. We have multiple GPL enforcement actions open at all times, and we've gotten compliance on nothing for the last 2 years. Instead, we sit on conference calls. We hear from litigation counsel. In fact, I just heard about this unbelievable situation. You know, folks in the Linux community who are against GPL enforcement say, oh, you just talk to the engineers. If you just talk to the engineers, you'll get compliance. We had an email to us just in the last month where a Linux developer themselves decided to email around to some companies. They saw a device wasn't in compliance. They knew developers, upstream developers who worked at that company and thought, oh, I'll just email everybody and say, hey, this device is out of compliance. You know, the source code doesn't build and it's not the right source code. And we really just need to get it from you. And this person, instead of getting answers from all their colleagues at these companies who are the engineers, the way we've been told by the developers, by the folks who don't want to see copyleft, oh, if you just write to the engineers, it'll all get sorted out. Instead, this developer was told, you need to have a phone call with someone a lawyer in the general counsel's office if you want to talk about this matter further. This person was just trying to get the source code for a device that they bought. And indeed, this tracks with what happens to Conservancy. Far too often, we write to get source code for a device. We send a simple letter following the instructions on how to get source code with a written offer, as the GPL says, and we get back a letter from the general counsel's office or a letter from the litigation counsel. That's what happens when you just ask for source code. Can you imagine a young person buying their first Linux-based device? They get some IoT device, has Linux in it. They say, oh, I can get the source code. Can you imagine like a 14-year-old person writing and asking for the source code and getting a letter back from a lawyer? Do you think they're actually going to have a call with that lawyer at 14 years old? I'm doing this for the next generation of Linux developers. I want people, when they start school, like I did in 1991 when I started university, to be able to get Linux and install it and rebuild it just like I did. But they can't right now. They get a device with Linux on it, they try to reinstall or rebuild it, and the next thing they know, they're having a conference call with a lawyer to try and figure out how to get the source code out of the company. This is not how the GPL was supposed to work at all. The fact of the matter is there's lots of talk about supposed GPL compliance out there, but very little actual compliance. I coined this term the compliance industrial complex a few years ago, I guess about 10 years ago now. And this is a giant industry now. Millions and millions of dollars are being spent in staff salaries. Millions and millions of dollars are being spent in buying products. And what they have for us is things that will index all the licensing information of all your source code and make it machine readable for you. Has nothing to do with what the GPL really requires, which is the complete corresponding source and the ability to install it. I have been saying for years, the compliance industrial complex will not solve the fundamental compliance problem with copyleft licenses until they solve the halting problem and can say they can test the source code automatically to make sure it builds and installs. A human being has to do that. And in these companies that include Linux, a human being never actually does that. They don't test their source release. They don't see if it actually works. The engineer who does the actual creation of the product doesn't even know what the source release is that was put out there. They upstream the parts they want to upstream and move on to the next product. The users are left holding an empty bag without any source code. We're going to execute on our plan at Conservancy. In the meantime, there are things you can do to help us. If you have a device that you think runs Linux, look in the manual, look in the menus on the screen where it says about and legal notices, and see if there's an offer for source or if the GPL is mentioned. If the GPL is mentioned or there's an offer for source, write to whatever address is there and ask for the source code. When you get that source code, or I should say, if you get that source code, try to test that source code. Make sure that you can build and install the executable. If you can't, email us and tell us about it. Tell us what the product is. Tell us what you tried and tell us how it didn't work so that we can continue to find what companies are violating the GPL. In the meantime, we're going to be looking seriously at going back to court for the GPL. The time has come. I would expect you will see a lawsuit over the GPL before the end of 2021 from Software Freedom Conservancy. There are companies who will continue to tell us that they won't follow the GPL unless we actually sue them, so we will have to sue them. But also, we don't merely want to get source for source's sake. We are going to be investing resources, and we received a wonderful grant from ARDC to go towards this. We're going to try to make alternative firmwares for the devices for which we get source. We want to see the next generation of OpenWRT projects started inside Conservancy, and we're going to put resources behind making them happen. I really thank you for your time and for listening to this talk. It is a difficult time for people who like to speak at conferences and care about software freedom. I was able to get most of this done with almost all free software. Unfortunately, OBS does not work on any device I had that didn't have a proprietary GPU. I used my spouse's laptop, which she kindly allowed me to use. She has a free software Debian box completely, but has a proprietary GPU, and I was able to get OBS running. I'm admittedly frustrated that so much of LCA is being done with proprietary software. I don't know if I'm going to be doing Q&A with you after this because I don't know if we're going to be able to do it with a free software solution. We've offered up our BBB, Big Blue Button instance at Conservancy for my and Karen Sandler's talk to do Q&A, which we hope will work, but it may not turn out to be logistically possible. I am not criticizing the LCA organizers for using proprietary software. They did the best they could in the time frame allotted, and as one of them said to us, we're just using the tools that we find lying around to try and get this conference up and running. So I understand, but it's very much for somebody who's a software freedom advocate and tries very hard to avoid proprietary software, like going to a conference that has no vegetarian options for any of the meals. That's what it feels like when I go to a conference where so much of the stuff is proprietary. And I think the LCA organizers have done a good job making the best of a really bad situation in COVID. But the most important thing is to really think about how much proprietary software is involved and how much we're using, and just be mindful of it, as Karen and I said in our talk at last year's LCA when we were all together at the Gold Coast. Here's some legal details of the talk. I want to be clear that I'm licensing it under CC by SA, not the NC license. I think the NC licenses from CC, which was the default for this conference, I was sad to hear, are not good choices. My anecdote about that is to remind everybody that in 1991, when Linux was first released, it was not under the GPL. The first version that Linus Torvalds released of Linux was under a non-commercial use only license. He changed to the GPL because user groups were saying to him, well, what do we do if we burn it onto a CD and want to recover the costs of the CDs? If it's non-commercial use only, that was commercial because we're making money. And it was those requests that made Linus realize that the GPL was a much better license than a non-commercial use only. CC by SA is a much, much, much better license than any of the NC versions of CC licenses. So I want to be clear, this talk and the slides, other than the third-party images, are licensed under CC by SA, not CC by NC. Thank you all for listening to my talk. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to seeing you all again, hopefully in 2022 at the next LCA. I hope the vaccines get to all of us and we'll be able to look back on this pandemic and all be together again soon. Thank you so much for coming to my talk.